Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to These Go to 11. Once again, I'm Nathan Bell, and joining me a lot closer than normal is
What's up,
Greg
my
Dutcher.
friend? I feel like Tom Brady and the other guy that is doing all the play-by-play.
That's right.
I mean, how many people get this close, this access?
Dude, I don't think we've ever been this close
No,
on this podcast before.
I'm not sure Lisa would be this close to
That's
me,
right.
or Joy would be that close to you. So, it's tight quarters, but I
That's
love
right.
being with you, brother, for sure.
So
Um,
excited. And we have limited time today, so we
yes.
do want to introduce our guest, Eliza Huie. Greg, you're going to go ahead and give a little bit of information, and then we're going to turn it over to you, Eliza, to tell us a little bit about yourself. Before Greg does that, how are you today?
I'm actually doing really well. As we're recording this, it's getting a little bit warmer after this terrible cold spell, so I'm
Yes.
I'm doing good. I like that.
Good,
Nice. Yeah.
good, Eliza. And as we were talking just before we quote unquote went live today, you're not far from us. You're in Northern Virginia,
Hmm.
kind of that DC suburb area.
Yeah,
That is the place I love going to, except that I have to drive in it.
I know.
Uh, and you
Yeah.
probably know all about that. We were talking beforehand. Congratulations, Eliza. You are yet another guest. We've been doing a series with several just wonderful authors, of which you are a part. And Nathan and I, every time we look at everyone's resume and credentials, feel like, my word, we've accomplished nothing in our entire lives. So thank you for reminding us of that. But I do just want to highlight a few things here for our audience as well to kind of get to know you, because I know sometimes it's harder. We have all these humble guests, so I'm going to brag on their
There you
credentials
go.
a little bit, brother. And Eliza, I know you hold a Master of Arts in Counseling from Biblical Theological Seminary. And we share that background, which is just really, really cool. And that's where my credentials evaporate at that point. You have done a lot of work, I know, with CCEF and gotten a lot of training there, which is just a fantastic, really gospel-centered counseling group. David Pallison, there's so
Mm.
many folks that have been connected with them through the years. There's just not time. You are also, if I have this right, a licensed clinical professional counselor, certified clinical professional trauma therapist. Again, I'm just going down and down. And you currently serve as the director of counseling at McLean Bible Church, wonderful church with a tremendous history, uh, just where you are down the road from us in Vienna, Virginia. And I know you have taught at several seminaries. You've served as a guest adjunct faculty, and you have written a slew of books that we're going to reference a few today, and one that's coming out, which we're excited to talk to you about. So that's all those credentials, which doesn't scratch the surface. And we're honored to have you with us today. And could you tell us just a little bit about yourself as a person,
Sure.
marriage, family, kids, all that fun stuff?
Yeah, those are the more important things I feel like. So I've been married for 33 years to my husband Ken, and we have three children. Our oldest will be turning 30 this year, so it feels like a huge milestone. And him and his wife, they live in Maryland still, and they have our only grandchild. So we are thrilled about that little grandson who's about a year old. And then I also have a daughter who's also in Maryland. She's a vet tech in that area. And then my other son is my youngest is married and he lives in New York with his wife. So that's kind of our family. They're grown and flown and doing all the great things, but it's always enjoyable to have them come around from time to time. So
Yes, and it doesn't sound like you and your husband are just by the pool drinking a drink with an umbrella in it. You are hands-on, super involved
yeah.
in your work and the things God has called you to, and we are the better for it. So again, we're thrilled to have you as a guest. Nathan, you called an audible right before the podcast to
I
change things up.
I
So
did. So, we were Eliza probably, as Greg said before, we were not as organized getting questions and things like that to you. And so, we had sent you questions planning on talking about one of your other books, and then you sent us some information saying that, oh, I've got a book that's releasing next week, actually, February 4th, where we actually decided that we're gonna change our release schedule
yeah,
on the podcast so that we can feature this fresh for
Wow.
our listeners. So February 4th, 2025, you have a book releasing called Trauma Aware.
Mhm.
And so we're going to take this podcast to discuss that, talk about that, promote that. And at the end of the podcast, we're going to tell our listeners how they can be entered to win a copy. We'll actually give away 2 copies of this book, and we'll tell them how to do that. But Trauma Aware, you've written so many other things, but we're going to focus on this one. Tell us about Trauma Aware as its upcoming release next week.
Sure. Well, and I'm so glad to make this pivot. I'm certainly happy to talk about other things again, but I do think that this is a topic that really does hit the church in a very significant way, because trauma, as most people will know, is a little bit more of a common topic these days. Maybe you want to even call it a buzzword. People are talking about it quite a bit. And when that happens, oftentimes the church can kind of scramble and feel like, what do I need to know? How do I even approach this? What does the Bible say about this topic? And I think whether when I say the church, I'm not just talking about pastors and leaders, but just people who call themselves Christians, the body of Christ, brothers and sisters in Christ, can kind of be wondering, well, what do we have to offer? Certainly the Bible is very sufficient to meet us in all of those places. And yet there can be times where we can kind of feel like, okay, but where do I go? What do I say? And especially when it begins to hit closer to home. And I think it's important to understand that the statistics and the research is now showing us that 70% of us will experience a traumatic event in our lifetime. And that just keeps going up. And I think it kind of keeps going up because we're so much more exposed to trauma. Just, recently watching the fires in Southern California, we're not just exposed to it, but we can zoom in on it. We can rewatch it over and over and over again, and not being aware how much that's affecting us or affecting our kids who are being raised in this kind of a generation. And so I think more than ever, the church needs resources. And that's really was my heart. I wanted to bring my experience in clinical counseling, my experience in biblical counseling, my experience in the counseling room, and just being able to say, okay, what can friends, mentors, pastors, leaders, lay counselors, or even professional counselors who want to approach this from a more biblical approach, what can they have kind of in hand to be able to say, okay, these are some things I really need to be aware of, since 70% of us are experiencing something traumatic in our lifetime.
Eliza, I was wondering, could you help us? What is a good working definition of trauma so that we kind of understand what are we talking about when we say trauma? Like what would that encompass? What would that
Yeah.
be defined as?
I think a lot of times we're asking that question because we hear things like, well, somebody said, I broke up with my boyfriend. I was so mad and it just traumatized me, or something. And it's like,
Right.
okay, maybe you were really upset at the time, or maybe they weren't angry. They were just so hurt and it was traumatizing. There is a difference between just something that is upsetting, something that is distressing, something that is up, like a season of maybe suffering, and something that is traumatic. And I think it is actually helpful. And I can just, I have my book here. I can just read the definition that I think is most helpful. And I'll tell you why I think it's most helpful
Yeah.
after I read it. So this is a definition from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So it's an acronym called SAMHSA. And if you're in the clinical world, you've heard of that, but they have defined trauma this way. They said it's resulting from an event or a series of events or a life-threatening circumstance. Oftentimes it is that it may not actually be life-threatening, but you will have perceived it to be life-threatening.
Mhm.
That is experienced as from the individual as emotionally and physically harmful, and that has lasting adverse or negative effects on a person's, and this is where it's important to keep in mind, the negative effects tend to breach these areas: a person's mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And I love that this secular organization adds that spiritual component, because they do realize, like, it's going to impact us negatively in our physical, emotional, relational, but it's also that spiritual component as well comes into play. And really, trauma makes us theologians. It makes us question, it makes us explore, like, what do I really believe? Why do I believe that? And so essentially, trauma is having an event or a series of events. It can be repeated small things that lead you to a place of feeling like, my well-being has been threatened in such a way that I'm not sure I'm going to be okay. And I think a key thing in trauma to keep in mind is that experience of powerlessness to do anything about it. And so that's sort of, certainly there's distressing events, but we really want to kind of focus on, has it had these lasting adverse effects? And was this person kind of feeling powerless and maybe even like their safety and well-being was threatened?
Well, if there's so many things I want to ask you, Eliza, in this short window. So I'm going to take the risk of being a little bit self-centered and ask the pastoral question. I'll preface it by saying several years ago, I mean, almost 25, 26 years ago, when I was a much younger pastor, I was talking to a man who I discovered sort of maybe halfway through the second time we met. Um, he was a Gulf War veteran.
Mm,
He had seen and experienced some terrible things, and that was the first time I recognized I don't really fully understand what he's going through. But the
mhm.
pastor always feels like he's got to have an answer, right? He's got to
Right.
have the scriptures right there. Just wanted to open that up to you. Thoughts on pastors, church in general, counselors, um, what we need to know about trauma. And I know that's many, many things. You're going to serve us well with this book. But what advice would you have for people in my shoes in terms of how to just learn more and be better equippers and
Yeah.
comforters?
Yeah, and I don't think you're alone. I do think there is something unique about pastors or church leaders, ministry leaders, people who the congregation or the people who attend, your church tend to look to you as, this is where I'm going to find my support, my direction, my wisdom in this area. So I do think there's added pressure, but I think that can also be true to maybe a parent whose child has gone through something traumatic. The kids are looking to the parent, or maybe a close, trusted friend. We often turn to those people who we feel like they've navigated life a little better than us to look for help. But oftentimes, just like you are sharing, that can be the experience of, I'm not sure if I'm even seeing, like, is this trauma, can be the first question. Like,
Yes.
I don't know. It's hard to know if this is trauma. And then you see it and it's like, okay, then what do I do? And those are two really good questions. The first thing I would say is, and this is, something that I've tried to really provide hands-on kind of tangible tools for people who are boots on the ground like you guys. And one of the things that I came up with is just a basic trauma questionnaire. It's 15 questions. I
Mm.
call it the BTQ, Basic Trauma Questionnaire 15, and you can find it on my website. It's part of the resources in this book. And I'll give you the link that you can share with the listeners to know exactly how to get to that, because it's a little bit hidden on my website, but it's absolutely free. But it's also at the back of the book, and so are the links. But it's what I am really offering to people, like what you're explaining there,
That's great.
to be able just to assess, like, these are the things that I'm seeing. Could this be trauma? So that's just a tool. But oftentimes, if we don't have a tool, we can look for certain things that you're seeing. And so trauma hides. Trauma
Yeah.
hides in a lot of different things, and it has ways of manifesting that look very different. So it can look like a person really isolating. It can look like a person who is maybe not very cooperative or doesn't seem to want to engage, I guess, doesn't want to really engage in maybe the church body or,
Yeah.
Bible study or small group or whatever. They kind of are a little bit hesitant to get too involved. And yet you see that community is so needed in their life because they're
Yeah.
a little bit isolated. But the reason why oftentimes they don't want to engage is because there is this fear of trusting others based on what they've gone through.
Mm.
Sometimes it can show up in other kind of secondary emotions, things like anger, things like anxiety, or even depression. And so if you're seeing a lot of these kind of what would be classified as mental health concerns, you don't want to just say it's trauma, but you want to at least hold as a category, I wonder if this person has been through something traumatic. And so I think one of the ways that we see it a lot is in relational dynamics,
Yeah.
because trauma puts you in a place of feeling like whatever you went through that was traumatic, you feel very unsafe. And oftentimes, which is what is part of what makes it traumatic, is that situation of feeling unsafe, or that situation of being unsafe, happened at the hands of somebody who should have been trustworthy.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
it's really hard for them to trust other people. And so they can come across as people who are maybe like distant, or they don't really engage and so forth. And we just want to be mindful that just because somebody isn't going to small group doesn't mean they're traumatized. But we want to see if there's a lot of these other things that are showing up, that maybe we want to say, I wonder if there's been traumatization that's happened in their
Interesting.
life. Yeah.
Very small question here, Eliza. You don't have to spend much time on it. I'm just curious on a personal level. Does it bother you, the colloquial use of trauma? Somebody says, "Oh man, I went to the grocery store. They were out of my Ben and Jerry's. I was traumatized." I mean, just you, because you've been a boots on the ground person.
Yeah.
Does that bug you? Would you prefer it not, or do you kind of get it and just say, "Well, people are people. They say these things."
I mean, I do tend to hold it lightly, but it is a little bit discouraging to me, because I do think it tends to make the topic of trauma less of an area where we actually want to dive into, because we've made it so commonplace. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes. Well, that I'm glad. I kind of suspected, because I've talked to counselors a lot, and I'm a jokester. I'm learning to be more careful, pastorally as well, and just personally. Can't say I'm always succeeding, but I recognize that, because you never know what a person's experience is. So just general thoughts. Obviously, I think there's not a church in the world that would disagree with this. Our church, where Nathan and I both serve, we want to be the safest place on earth. I think I'm
Mm.
stealing an old maybe Larry Crabb phrase, or somebody that used that phrase, but we really do. We want to be a very safe place for people. Um, just thoughts on how the church can practically go about becoming a very clear, safe community for people that have had these traumatic experiences, to feel that they can ease in.
Yeah. Such a good question. I'm so glad you guys are asking it as pastors, as leaders in the church, because I think that's really where it starts, is pastors need to be asking that question. And there's a whole lot of things that we do in church that are not helpful for people who have been traumatized. And I'll just name a couple, and then maybe, because not everybody who's listening is going to be a pastor, but then I'll go like maybe one-on-one church congregant.
Yeah.
But from the leadership level, I think there's definitely some stuff. First of all, we have to acknowledge our shortcomings. We have to acknowledge that the church has not been a place that people turn to when they are struggling with significant mental health issues. And I really believe that can change. And we have so many more resources, even like this book, that help us to be a better resource. But so we just want to acknowledge that. But the other thing I would say, corporately, as a church, we can grow in our knowledge of these things. So this podcast is a step towards that. Like, just even, we're going to talk about it. Honestly, that's one of the best things that I tell pastors all the time, is like, mention it, just say the words, so that people know, like, okay, this is a place where they talk about those things. That it's the same with other big topics like abuse or sexual assault or things like that. Say those words, and then people feel already like, okay, this is a place that they may not have all the answers, but they're talking about it. And then I would also just say, be careful in your assumptions, because churches can often be a place where we so want people to feel at home. We want it to be a family. We want it to be welcoming. And so people come in maybe the first or second time, and we can be really quick to like either just grab their hand and shake their hand, or sometimes we just want to give them a hug. Hey, welcome. We're so glad you're here. Physical touch can be very distressing to people who have been through traumatization. So better for us as leaders to be able to say, hey, I'm so glad you're here. Can I shake your hand? Would you be okay with that? Or if there's maybe even a circumstance where they feel you're noticing that they're rather distressed, and maybe they've come up for prayer because they are distressed, to simply ask them, would it be okay if I put my hand on your shoulder as I pray for you? Or would you prefer it if I just stand beside you and pray, giving them that option and that choice. Because remember, I said people who have been through trauma felt powerless. So giving them that little bit of, I'm willing to do whatever I can to make you feel safe with me as a person who doesn't know you. And then I would also just say, yeah, learn more about it for sure. Bring in people who can talk with your congregation or offer a workshop or things like that. Those are always great. But the other thing that pastors and leaders can do is to connect with the other believers who are in professional counseling. So if there are professional counselors in your community, to get to know them, to make them feel like you are a welcome part of our extension of resources. And so I like to meet with other counselors who are doing the work to be able to learn, like, hey, how do you bring scripture into your counseling? Or what does it look like when somebody's, oh my goodness, been traumatized by the church? And that's just another thing we can mention, is that sometimes the church has been the source of trauma. So if we can actually acknowledge that, that goes a long way. So that what I would say is more leadership. And then there's a whole lot that people can do one-on-one. So the congregation, people who are in your church, can again learn a little bit more about trauma. That's always going to be the thing. But I would say one of the best things you can do, whether you're the pastor or you're a congregant or you're a friend or a family member, is to listen and listen well and listen long. And just about the time you feel like, okay, I've listened really well, then start listening again and
Yep.
don't go quickly into problem solving. Oftentimes, what can be the most helpful thing for a person is to have a space where they can share whatever it is they need to share, whether it's their trauma story or not. Because sometimes they're not going to share that trauma story, but they're going to see, are you a person who listens to me well? And really, really, really avoid assumptions. So you're going to ask people, as they're telling you what they're struggling with, to define their terms, to explore a little bit more, like, hey, when you said that, what did you mean by feeling unsafe? What does it mean when you say unsafe? You're just taking a word that they've used and ask them to tell me more about it. But I would say there's a whole lot more I could tell you, but one of the things I think is really going to be important is to make sure that we affirm, like, you are not a burden here. What you've gone through is difficult, and it makes sense that you're struggling. Like, that's the validation, but you are not a burden to anybody here. I'm glad that you told me, and just giving that affirming, supportive confirmation to them.
That's so good. I was wondering, Eliza, if you could speak to, Greg and I have talked about this before, but the church has really done a job in the past about, stigmatizing treatments, whether it be
Mm.
medications or therapy, things like that. Could you walk us through just kind of the healthy biblical perspective that no, 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 God does want you to seek out help in treatment. He wants you to be realistic about the things that you're going through and suffering, and seek that help and attention that you need for that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And you started the podcast listing a whole bunch of letters and all that. I was just teaching a group of counseling students, and I did tell them this was a basic, introduction to biblical counseling. And I touched a little bit on trauma, and I did tell them there is a difference between regular counseling and trauma care. And especially when somebody is dealing with like flashbacks or triggers or unwanted somatic responses, there's just a lot of things that come into play that are going to be helpful, that you understand how trauma impacts the body, how it impacts the brain. And so I do think there is space for you to be able to say, I want to care for you well. And part of caring for you well is to introduce you to potential resources. If you want to explore those, I'd be happy to explore them with you, if that's something that you have the bandwidth to do with them. But to let them know, like, hey, I recognize that my lane I hit the end of my lane in this category sometimes. Now I can be supportive. I can pray for you. I can be here, and we can talk as much as you want, but I want you to get the specific care you need. And sometimes, not every time, but sometimes it's going to be helpful for you to see a professional. And when you talk about medication, I will just touch briefly on that, just because I know a lot of people ask that question, and people listening are probably wondering whether it's trauma or other significant issues that have impacted their lives, like anxiety or depression, where medication might come into the conversation. The way I approach medication is I approach it as, we need to look at it as a wisdom issue. So we want to walk in wisdom in that. And the best way we walk in wisdom is we talk to people who have been given a little bit more wisdom. I am not a medical doctor. And so oftentimes people will come into my office and they'll share certain things that I realize that sounds like a medical issue. And so I'll point them to that. So I want to have good relationships with people who I know in the psychiatric field, who I know are sensitive or even affirming of the same faith that people have. And so getting to know those people and just letting them know, hey, it doesn't mean you're going to need to be on medication. That's something that's not only a wisdom issue, but it's a conscience issue. How do you feel in your conscience of taking these things? And then ultimately, and this is where I think the church could really, let's just land here, it's a personal issue. It's not my decision to impose on somebody what they should do with their physical body. And especially in trauma, that's often been the case if somebody has imposed their power on their physical body. So I want to be able to walk with them as wisely as possible and point them to the right resources.
Love that, Eliza. We want to honor the time. We knew, didn't we, brother? This was going
Yeah,
to feel like 5
I
minutes
know.
because
I
it's so
know.
good. I bet you thought about this, and we can't wait to get your book. But I kind of want to give you the last word on this, Eliza. And it doesn't have to be technical or theologically precise. Just your thoughts, because I know you're like us, a lover of the good news, lover of the
Mhm.
gospel, and that's everything. Your thoughts on just people that are dealing with trauma,
Yeah.
just what kind of hope or an aspect of that hope does the gospel impart?
Wow, that's such a good question. I think the thing that I hold most when I'm talking about trauma is that I'll have people ask me, can I get through this? Can I get over it? And I always answer with, absolutely. I wouldn't keep doing this work if I didn't know that because of the resurrection, because of the fact that God is a God of redemption, because not only that, like those things that he will make all things new, but even here and now, Psalm, I think 34, is that where it is? Psalm 34, where it talks about God is near to the brokenhearted and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. Like that's such a verse for those who have been traumatized. He is near to you. It says he bottles up your tears. He knows every single one of them. There's an intimacy in God, and God gives us that. He gives us that witness that he has seen what has happened to you, and he will render the judgment accordingly. And he gives us this witness where he is with us in this process. And so I think the thing that I would leave with people who have gone through this, or maybe somebody they love is dealing with traumatization. Trauma does not have the last word. It is not stronger than the gospel. It is not more powerful than the God who loves them and cares for them.
Well,
Thank you so much for that. Before we even started, you offered to be able to come back on and talk about other things, and I feel like we could have you back on and talk about this for another 3 or 4 hours.
easily.
And so we just want to thank you for that. We do want to honor your time, and we want to let our listeners know that and watchers that you can try to receive a copy of Eliza's book. So if you email us or you do a little shout out on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, anywhere that we put our social media stuff out, and just comment that you watched Eliza's podcast with us today, we will go ahead and put you into that drawing to receive one of 2 copies of the book Trauma Aware. And so, Eliza, once again, thank you so much for your
Yes.
insights and the time that you've taken. This has been so valuable for us. I know Greg and I, we've just been enjoying this series, being able to offer this to not only ourselves, but being able to offer this to our church members and our listeners. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for talking about it. It matters.
Absolutely, Eliza. Thank you. And to echo Nathan, we are going to get you back on.
Yeah.
Great.
We know
Sounds
you're
good.
going on to another call, so
Yes.
we want to let you go, but thank you for being with us
Yes.
today,
Thank you
Eliza.
guys.
You bet.
Okay.
We're going to go ahead and sign off now.
Okay.